April 15th, 2024. A Tuesday afternoon in Portland, Oregon. Brian Thompson stood in what had been a cramped, oddly configured second-floor bedroom of the Victorian house he and his wife Jennifer had purchased just 6 weeks earlier. At 38 years old, Brian had been in construction for nearly 20 years and had renovated dozens of homes. He knew buildings, knew their quirks and secrets, knew how to read the story a structure told through its walls and floors and ceilings. And this wall in front of him, the one he'd been demolishing for the past 2 hours, was telling him something wasn't right. The house itself was impressive, a 3-story Victorian built in 1892 with all the elaborate details of that era. Crown molding, ornate woodwork, a grand staircase, stained glass windows. It had been on the market for nearly a year before Brian and Jennifer had bought it, primarily because it needed extensive work, and because, as their realtor had carefully put it, the property had a complicated history that made some buyers uncomfortable. The house had belonged to the Hartwell family for 3 generations. The last owner, Gerald Hartwell, had died in October 2023 at age 89 with no direct heirs. Distant relatives had inherited the property and wanted to sell it quickly, listing it as is at a price significantly below market value. Brian and Jennifer had seen potential where others had seen problems. Jennifer, 36 and an interior designer, had loved the architectural details. Brian had appreciated the solid structure beneath the neglect. And both of them had wanted a project, a family home they could restore and make their own for their 2 children, ages 7 and 5. This particular bedroom on the second floor had been strange from the beginning. A wall had divided what should have been a good-sized room into 2 awkward spaces, a narrow room and an even narrower hallway that seemed to serve no real purpose. Brian had decided to remove the dividing wall to restore the room's original proportions. But as he'd swung his sledgehammer into the drywall that afternoon, he'd immediately noticed something unusual. The wall was much thicker than it should have been. A standard interior wall would be about 4.5 inches thick, 2 sheets of drywall with wooden studs between them. This wall was at least 14 inches thick, maybe more. Curious, Brian had continued carefully, peeling away layers. First came drywall, then wooden studs, then more drywall, then insulation. And then, when he'd broken through that layer, his sledgehammer had struck something solid that sent a jarring shock up his arms. Brick. Someone had built a brick wall and then concealed it behind a frame of wood and drywall to make it look like an ordinary interior partition. Brian stopped swinging the sledgehammer and switched to a smaller hammer and chisel, working carefully now, curious about what he'd find. Who builds a brick wall inside a house and then hides it behind drywall? What were they trying to seal off? At 2:30 p.m., he broke through the brick layer and created an opening large enough to shine his work light through. What he saw on the other side made him step back, his heart suddenly pounding. It was a room, a complete room, approximately 10 by 12 feet, that had been entirely sealed off. And it was furnished. There was a bed with a floral bedspread, dusty but intact, a dresser with a mirror, a chair, photographs in frames on the walls, clothes hanging in an open closet, a pair of shoes beside the bed, positioned as if someone had just stepped out of them. The room was covered in decades of dust. Thick cobwebs draped from the ceiling and stretched between furniture. The air that came through the opening smelled stale and dead, as if it had been trapped for a very long time. But everything was there, preserved, like a capsule from another era. "Jennifer!" Brian called out, his voice unsteady. "Jennifer, you need to come up here right now." When Jennifer arrived and looked through the opening Brian had made, she felt the same chill her husband had felt. This wasn't just a sealed storage room or a forgotten space. This was someone's bedroom, someone's personal space, deliberately closed off and hidden. And there was something deeply disturbing about the deliberateness of it. The brick wall, the layers of concealment, the preservation of every personal item, as if the room's occupant might return at any moment. Together, they carefully widened the opening and stepped inside. The dust rose with their movements, caught in the afternoon light coming through the hole they'd created. Jennifer noticed that what should have been windows, you could see their outlines on the exterior of the house, had been bricked over from the outside and sealed. This room had been made into a tomb. Not for a body, but for a life that had been lived here. On the walls were photographs, old ones, showing a young woman with shoulder-length brown hair and a warm smile. Some showed her with an older man, who was clearly her father or another paternal figure. A graduation photo hung prominently, showing the same woman in cap and gown. The year printed at the bottom of the photo was 1976. On the dresser were personal items that made the scene even more unsettling. A hairbrush with strands of hair still caught in its bristles. Jewelry boxes, perfume bottles in styles that looked to be from the 1970s. A purse hung over the back of the chair, and when Brian looked inside, he found a wallet. The wallet contained several items: some cash, a couple of credit cards, and a driver's license from the state of Oregon. The license showed the same woman from the photographs, smiling confidently at the camera. The name on the license was Catherine Marie Hartwell. Date of birth: June 12, 1954. The license had been issued in 1977. Brian and Jennifer looked at each other, the implication sinking in. Hartwell, the same surname as the family who'd owned this house for generations. This Catherine must have been related to Gerald Hartwell, the man who died last year, the man they'd bought the house from. Jennifer pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. "Catherine Hartwell, Portland, Oregon missing," she searched. The results that came up made her breath catch. "Brian," she said quietly, showing him the screen, "we need to call the police right now." Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What Brian and Jennifer discovered in that sealed room would reopen a case that had been cold for 46 years. The disappearance of a young woman who'd vanished without a trace in 1978, and the dark secret her family had kept hidden behind a wall for nearly half a century. Catherine Marie Hartwell had been officially reported missing on August 23, 1978. She'd been 24 years old at the time, a young woman just starting her adult life, living with her father in the family home. This very house where Brian and Jennifer now stood in her sealed bedroom. According to archived newspaper articles that Jennifer found on her phone while waiting for police to arrive, Catherine had left home on a Monday morning, supposedly heading to work as a receptionist at a medical office downtown. She'd never arrived. Her car had been found later that day, parked just 3 blocks from her house, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. The Portland Police Bureau had investigated extensively in 1978. Catherine was the only child of Richard Hartwell, a respected accountant who'd inherited the Victorian house from his own parents. Catherine's mother, Margaret, had died of cancer in 1975, 3 years before Catherine's disappearance. Richard had reported his daughter missing and had cooperated fully with the investigation. He'd appeared devastated by her disappearance. He'd provided photographs, described what she'd been wearing that morning, gave police access to her room and personal belongings. Search parties had combed the neighborhood. Investigators had interviewed friends, co-workers, anyone who'd known Catherine. But no trace of her had been found. No body. No clues about where she'd gone or what had happened to her. The case had eventually gone cold, filed away as an unsolved disappearance. Over the years, as Catherine's name had faded from public memory, she'd become just another statistic, another young woman who'd vanished without explanation. Richard Hartwell had continued living in the house after his daughter's disappearance. According to public records and the information Brian and Jennifer had been given when they'd purchased the property, Richard had become increasingly reclusive over the years following Catherine's disappearance. He'd never remarried. He'd maintained the house, but had few visitors and little social life. Neighbors from that era remembered him as quiet, polite, but distant, a man who seemed to carry a profound sadness. Richard had died in 1992 of a heart attack at age 68. The house had passed to his younger brother Gerald, who'd been 58 at the time. Gerald, like his brother, had never married and had lived alone in the house for the next 31 years until his death in October 2023. Gerald, too, had been described by neighbors as reclusive, quiet, someone who kept to himself. The house had developed a reputation in the neighborhood over the decades, the Hartwell house, where something tragic had happened long ago, though few people remembered the details anymore. It had become one of those properties that people pointed to while walking by, saying things like, "That's the house where that girl disappeared back in the 70s. But no one had known that Catherine's bedroom had been sealed up like a shrine, hidden behind a false wall, preserved exactly as she'd left it on the last morning she'd been seen alive. The Portland Police Bureau responded to Brian and Jennifer's call within 20 minutes. 2 patrol officers arrived first, followed shortly by detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. When Detective Sarah Morrison, a 48-year-old veteran investigator, stepped through the opening in the wall and saw the preserved bedroom, she immediately understood the significance of what had been found. "This entire house is now a crime scene," she told Brian and Jennifer. "I'm sorry, but you won't be able to stay here for a while. We need to process everything." Over the next week, the Thompson family stayed with Jennifer's parents while forensic teams meticulously examined the sealed room and the rest of the house. What they found would paint a disturbing picture of what might have happened to Catherine Hartwell in August 1978. The brick wall that had sealed the room had been constructed sometime between late August and early December 1978, based on analysis of the materials used and their condition. There were no building permits on file for any construction work on the house during that period, meaning whoever had built the wall had done so without official authorization. The wall hadn't been a rush job. Someone with a construction knowledge had carefully built a solid brick wall, then concealed it behind wooden framing and drywall to make it look like an ordinary interior partition. The windows had been bricked over from the outside, something that would have been visible to neighbors. But in 1978, in that particular neighborhood, houses were far enough apart that such work might not have attracted much attention. Most significantly, forensic teams found no human remains in the sealed room. Catherine wasn't there, but the presence of all her personal belongings, her wallet with her driver's license, her jewelry, her clothes, everything she would have needed if she'd left voluntarily, suggested strongly that she'd never actually left the house that August morning. The story that had been told in 1978, that Catherine had driven away from home and disappeared somewhere between her house and her workplace, began to look like exactly that. A story. Catherine Marie Hartwell had been born on June 12, 1954, the only child of Richard and Margaret Hartwell. Richard, born in 1924, had worked as an accountant for a respected firm in downtown Portland. Margaret, born in 1927, had been a homemaker and active in their church and community. The Hartwell family had lived in the Victorian house that Richard had inherited from his parents, who'd purchased it in the 1920s. It was a gracious home in a good old neighborhood, and by all accounts, Catherine had had a comfortable middle-class upbringing in the 1950s and 60s. She'd attended local schools, had been a good student, and had graduated from high school in 1972. She'd gone on to attend Portland State University, where she'd studied business administration. The graduation photo that hung in her sealed bedroom was from June 1976, showing her smiling and confident, ready to start her adult life. But 1975 had brought tragedy to the Hartwell family. Margaret, Catherine's mother, had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She'd fought the disease for 8 months before passing away in December 1975 at age 48. Catherine had been 21 years old, still in college, when she'd lost her mother. The loss had been devastating for both Catherine and Richard. In the months following Margaret's death, Catherine had moved back home to support her father. She'd taken a job as a receptionist at a medical office to help with expenses and had commuted to finish her degree at Portland State. Friends from that period would later describe Catherine as kind, responsible, and devoted to her father. She'd taken care of the house, managed the household duties her mother had handled, and tried to fill the void Margaret's death had left. But as 1976 became 1977 and then 1978, people who knew the Hartwell family began to notice something troubling about Richard's relationship with his daughter. He was, as several relatives would later describe it, excessively protective of Catherine in ways that seemed inappropriate for a young woman in her mid-20s. Richard didn't want Catherine to date. When she'd mentioned men she'd met at work or through friends, Richard had found fault with all of them. Too young, too old, wrong background, wrong profession. "No man is good enough for my daughter," he'd been heard to say on multiple occasions. Catherine had wanted to move into her own apartment in early 1978. At 23, she'd had a steady job and wanted the independence most young adults sought. But Richard had become upset at the suggestion. According to a cousin who'd been present for one conversation, Richard had said, "Your place is here, Catherine. You have a responsibility to this family, to this house. Your mother would want you here." The cousin had found Richard's reaction strange and somewhat controlling, but in 1978, it hadn't been entirely unusual for unmarried daughters, especially only children, to live at home with widowed parents. Cultural attitudes were different then. What might seem overly controlling in 2024 had been more accepted in that era. But beneath Richard's protectiveness had apparently been something darker, an inability to accept that his daughter was an adult with her own life, her own desires, her own need for independence. In June 1978, 2 months before her disappearance, Catherine had confided in a co-worker named Linda Martinez that she'd met someone. His name was David, and they'd been seeing each other secretly because Catherine knew her father wouldn't approve. David wanted Catherine to move in with him, and she'd been considering it seriously. "I'm 24 years old," Catherine had told Linda over lunch one day in July. "I should be able to make my own decisions. But you don't know my father. Ever since Mom died, he's become so possessive. He acts like I'm still a child, like I owe him my entire life because he's lonely. I love him, but I can't live like this forever." Linda had encouraged Catherine to have an honest conversation with her father, to explain that moving out didn't mean abandoning him, that she could still see him regularly and maintain their relationship while also having her own life. Catherine had said she would try. That had been in mid-August, just about a week before she disappeared. Monday, August 21st, 1978. According to what investigators would later piece together from interviews conducted in the weeks following Catherine's disappearance, something had changed in the Hartwell household that weekend. Neighbors had heard raised voices coming from the house on Sunday evening, August 20th. The windows had been opened due to summer heat, and the sound of an eagerly argument, angry voices, though the words weren't clear, had carried to the house next door. Monday morning, August 21st, Catherine had called in sick to work. Her supervisor at the medical office had noted that Catherine had sounded upset, had said she wasn't feeling well and needed a day or two off. The supervisor had told her to take the time she needed. On Tuesday, August 22nd, Catherine hadn't called work. The office had tried to reach her at home, but no one had answered the phone. On Wednesday, August 23rd, the medical office had called again. This time, Richard Hartwell had answered. He'd told them that Catherine had left for work that morning at her usual time, around 8:30 a.m. Concerned that she hadn't arrived, the office had called back around 11 a.m. Richard had sounded worried, had said he'd drive around looking for her. At 6 p.m., when Catherine still hadn't returned home or contacted anyone, Richard had called the Portland Police Bureau to report his daughter missing. The responding officers had taken down all the relevant information. Catherine was 24 years old, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing about 125 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair and brown eyes. Richard had provided a recent photograph showing Catherine smiling, wearing a blue dress, her hair pulled back with a headband. Richard had told police that Catherine had left the house that morning to go to work, as she did, every weekday. She'd been wearing tan slacks and a white blouse. She'd taken her purse and car keys. She'd seemed fine, maybe a little quiet, but not upset or worried about anything. When police had asked if Catherine had been having any problems, relationship issues, financial stress, anything that might explain a disappearance, Richard had said no, nothing at all. Catherine had been happy, had loved her job, had been close to her father. There was no reason she would have run away. Artsabi investigation had moved quickly. Officers had found Catherine's car parked on a residential street just 3 blocks from the Hartwell house. The 1974 Ford Pinto was locked, but the keys were in the ignition, and Catherine's purse was on the passenger seat. Her wallet was in the purse, containing her driver's license, credit cards, and $47 in cash. The location was puzzling. If Catherine had been driving to work, she would have gone in a different direction. For the youth, street where her car was found wasn't on her route. It looked as if she'd driven a few blocks from home and then… what? Been forced out of her car? Gotten into another vehicle? The car showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. Detectives had interviewed neighbors on the street where the car was found. No one had seen anything unusual. No one remembered seeing the Pinto arrive or seeing Catherine get out of it. The car had just appeared sometime Wednesday morning, and no one had paid it any attention until police came asking questions. The investigation had expanded quickly. Detectives interviewed Catherine's co-workers, her friends, anyone who'd known her. They'd learned about David, the boyfriend Catherine had mentioned to her co-worker Linda. But Linda didn't know David's last name, didn't know where he worked or lived. Catherine had been secretive about the relationship, had been afraid her father would find out. Police had tried to locate David, had asked anyone who knew Catherine if they knew about a boyfriend. But no one else had heard Catherine mention anyone named David. The trail went nowhere. Searches had been conducted in the neighborhoods around where Catherine's car was found and around the Hartwell house. Search parties had combed through local parks and wooded areas. Police had checked hospitals, morgues, bus stations, anywhere Catherine might have gone. But there was no trace of her. Richard Hartwell had been interviewed multiple times. He'd been cooperative, had allowed police to search the house, had provided anything they'd asked for. He'd seemed genuinely distraught about his daughter's disappearance. He'd called the police station daily, asking for updates, had offered a reward for information about Catherine's whereabouts. Detectives had looked at Richard as a possible suspect. They always looked at family members in missing person cases. But they'd found no evidence of foul play, no indication that Richard had been involved in anything suspicious. His colleagues at work had confirmed he'd been at the office all day Wednesday until he'd received the call from Catherine's workplace. He'd had no time to harm his daughter or hide a body. The case had received significant media coverage in Portland. Catherine's photograph had been shown on local news broadcasts. Her story had been in the newspapers. Tips had come in, but none had led anywhere. Someone thought they'd seen a woman matching Catherine's description at a bus station. Someone else thought they'd seen her getting into a car with a man. But when investigators followed up, none of the tips had panned out. As weeks became months, the active investigation had slowed. The case hadn't been closed. It had remained officially open. But without new leads, there was little police could do. The devastating reality was that people did sometimes disappear without a trace, and despite best efforts, they weren't always found. Richard Hartwell had continued living in secondary, the family home, alone now, with only memories of his wife and daughter. Neighbors had felt sorry for him, losing his wife to cancer and then losing his daughter to an unexplained disappearance. He'd seemed like a tragic figure, a man who'd lost everything. What none of them had known was that Catherine's bedroom, on the second floor of that Victorian house, had been sealed up like a tomb, with all her belongings preserved inside, hidden behind a brick wall that Richard had either built himself or hired someone to build sometime in the months after he'd reported his daughter missing. Richard Hartwell had lived in the house for another 14 years after Catherine's disappearance, continuing his work as an accountant, maintaining the property, living quietly and alone. Neighbors who'd known him during those years described him as withdrawn, sad, a man who seemed to carry a great burden of grief. He'd rarely had visitors. He'd gone to work, come home, maintained basic social courtesies with neighbors, but formed no close friendships. The house had slowly fallen into gentle neglect, not abandoned or ruined, but showing signs that the person living there had lost interest in anything beyond basic maintenance. Richard had died on March 7, 1992, of a heart attack. He'd been found in his bedroom by a colleague from work who'd come to check on him after Richard had failed to show up at the office for 2 days. He'd been 68 years old, alone in the house that had once held his wife and daughter. The property had passed to Richard's younger brother, Gerald Hartwell, who'd been 58 at the time. Gerald, who'd never married, had been living in an apartment across town and had moved into the family home after inheriting it. Gerald, like his brother, had been a quiet, private person. He'd worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm and had lived simply. For the next 31 years, Gerald had resided in the house, maintaining it. Minimally, living alone, having few social connections. One question that investigators in 2024 would struggle with was, did Gerald know about the sealed room? Had Richard told him? Or had Gerald discovered it on his own at some point after moving in? The sealed room was on the second floor, in an area of the house that Gerald might not have had much reason to closely examine. If Richard had told him, "That wall is structural, don't mess with it," Gerald might have accepted that and never questioned it. Or Gerald might have known exactly what was behind that wall and had chosen to keep his brother's secret, living in the house for over 3 decades, knowing that just beyond a wall was his niece's bedroom, sealed away like a shrine to his brother's crime. The truth about what Gerald knew died with him in October 2023, when he'd passed away in his sleep at age 89. He'd left no diary, no confession, no explanation about the house or its history. The two distant relatives who'd inherited the property from Gerald had never lived in the house and had no personal connection to the Hartwell family story. They'd known that something sad had happened decades ago, a girl who'd disappeared, but they'd known few details. They'd wanted to sell the property quickly and move on. When Brian and Jennifer Thompson had toured the house in February 2024, their realtor had mentioned briefly that a family member had gone missing in the 1970s, but that it had nothing to do with the house itself. The implication had been that Catherine had disappeared from somewhere else, that the house was just the place where a grieving family had lived afterward. No one had mentioned a sealed room. No one had known it existed. The forensic investigation of the sealed room and the rest of the house took place over a week in late April and early May 2024. What investigators found would fundamentally change the understanding of what had happened to Catherine Hartwell in August 1978. The sealed room itself was a disturbing mixture of preservation and decay. Everything was there. Every piece of furniture, every personal item, every indication that this had been a young woman's private space. But everything was covered in decades of dust, deteriorated by time and the sealed environment. The bedspread, once colorful, had faded to muted tones. The fabric was brittle in places where sunlight had leaked, through tiny gaps over the years. The clothes in the closet had been attacked by moths, leaving holes and threadbare areas. Books on a small shelf had warped, and their pages had yellowed. But photographs were still recognizable. Documents were still readable. And Catherine's driver's license, protected somewhat by being in a wallet, still showed her face clearly. The young woman who'd supposedly left this house one August morning and never returned. Forensic teams found no bloodstains, no evidence of violence in the room itself, but they didn't really expect to. Whatever had happened to Catherine, it most likely hadn't happened in her bedroom. What they did find, through careful analysis of the construction that had sealed the room, was a timeline. The brick wall had been built using materials and techniques common in the late 1970s. The mortar was consistent with what would have been available in 1978. The drywall that had been used to conceal the brick wall from the hallway side was a brand that had been manufactured between 1977 and 1982. Construction experts determined that building the wall would have taken several days, maybe a week for someone working alone, maybe less if they'd had help. It would have required someone with construction knowledge and access to materials and tools. It wasn't amateur work, it had been done competently. Richard Hartwell had worked as an accountant, not in construction, but investigators found records showing that in his youth, Richard had worked summers in construction while putting himself through college. He'd had the knowledge to build such a wall, and in the months after Catherine's disappearance, he'd had the time and privacy to do it without drawing attention. The absence of building permits suggested strongly that Richard hadn't wanted official records of the construction. He'd wanted the sealed room to remain a secret, hidden behind what appeared to be an ordinary wall. The question that haunted investigators was, why? If Richard had killed his daughter, accidentally or intentionally, and had disposed of her body somewhere, why seal up her room? Why preserve everything as if creating a memorial? The psychological profile that emerged suggested a man unable to let go of his daughter even after killing her. A man who'd wanted to preserve her space, keep it exactly as it had been, perhaps as a way of holding on to her or dealing with guilt. The sealed room hadn't been an attempt to hide evidence. Catherine's body wasn't there, and the room itself contained nothing incriminating beyond the fact that it had been deliberately concealed. It had been a shrine, a secret memorial to a daughter who would never return, but whose room would remain frozen in time, preserved behind a wall that only Richard knew about. The investigation expanded to include extensive interviews with anyone who'd known the Hartwell family in the 1970s and 80s. Many people had died or moved away, but some were still alive and had memories to share. A cousin, now in her 70s, remembered Richard as controlling after Margaret's death. He wouldn't let Catherine breathe, she told investigators. Everything she did, he had an opinion about. Who she should be friends with, what jobs she should take, whether she should go out in the evenings. It was like he thought Catherine existed only to take care of him. Another relative remembered Catherine mentioning that she wanted to move out. Richard got so angry, the relative recalled. He said Catherine was being selfish, that she was abandoning him the way her mother had abandoned him by dying. It was disturbing how he equated Catherine wanting independence with betrayal. And then there was Linda Martinez, the co-worker Catherine had confided in about David. Linda was 70 years old in 2024, retired and living in Salem, Oregon. When detectives contacted her and asked about Catherine, Linda broke down crying. "I've thought about her so many times over the years," Linda told detectives. "I've wondered if I should have done more, should have encouraged her to leave sooner, should have realized she was in danger. She was afraid of her father. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell. She was afraid of how he'd react if she tried to leave." Linda confirmed that Catherine had been planning to move in with David, whose last name, Catherine, had never mentioned, sometime in early September 1978. She said she was going to tell her father that weekend, in late August. She was nervous, but determined. She said she couldn't live like that anymore, being treated like a possession instead of a person. That weekend would have been August 19th and 20th, 1978. The weekend when neighbors had heard arguing coming from the Hartwell house, just 3 days before Catherine had been reported missing. The Portland Police Bureau officially reopened the Catherine Hartwell case as a homicide investigation in May 2024. Detective Sarah Morrison, who led the investigation, held a press conference to announce the findings and to ask for any additional information from the public. "We believe Catherine Hartwell died in August 1978, Detective Morrison said. "We believe she died in the family home, and we believe her father, Richard Hartwell, was responsible for her death and for concealing it. Unfortunately, both Richard Hartwell and his brother Gerald are deceased, which limits our ability to pursue prosecution. But we want Catherine's story to finally be told, and we want to bring whatever closure we can to anyone who knew her and has wondered all these years what happened to her." The theory that investigators developed, based on all the evidence they'd gathered, was this. On the weekend of August 19th and 20th, 1978, Catherine had told her father that she was moving out. She was 24 years old, had a steady job, and had met someone she cared about. She wanted to start her own life, separate from her father's control. Richard, unable to accept losing his daughter, had reacted with anger. An argument had escalated. And at some point, whether in rage, in panic, or in a desperate attempt to prevent Catherine from leaving, Richard had killed his daughter. It might have been unintentional. It might have started as physical restraint and gone too far. Or it might have been deliberate. Investigators would never know for certain. What happened next showed planning and calculation. Richard had disposed of Catherine's body. Where, investigators still didn't know and might never know. He'd staged the disappearance, parking Catherine's car a few blocks away with her purse inside to make it look like she'd been abducted while going to work. He'd waited what he probably thought was an appropriate amount of time before reporting her missing, so he wouldn't seem suspicious by reporting it too quickly. And then, in the weeks and months that followed, he'd sealed Catherine's bedroom. He'd built a brick wall, covered it with framing and drywall, made it look like an ordinary interior partition. He'd preserved everything inside, all of Catherine's belongings, all her personal items, the space she'd occupied in his life. He'd created a secret memorial that only he knew about, a shrine to the daughter he'd loved so possessively that he'd killed her rather than let her go. Richard had lived with that secret for 14 years until his death in 1992. What Gerald Hartwell knew remained unclear. He might have discovered the sealed room at some point and chosen to keep his brother's secret. Or Richard might have told him before dying. Or Gerald might never have known at all. The one thing investigators were certain about was that Catherine's body had never been in the sealed room. Where Richard had put her remained a mystery. He might have buried her somewhere on the property. The house sat on a quarter-acre lot, and ground-penetrating radar searches of the yard found several anomalies that would require excavation to investigate fully. He might have disposed of her body in a remote location, perhaps in the forests outside Portland. Without a confession or more evidence, the location of Catherine's remains might never be known. For Brian and Jennifer Thompson, the discovery had transformed their renovation project into something else entirely. The house that was supposed to be their family home had become the center of a major criminal investigation and intense media attention. They'd had to make a difficult decision: stay in the house and try to move forward, or sell it and find somewhere else. After long discussions, they'd decided to stay. The house itself wasn't evil, Jennifer argued. What had happened there was terrible, but it had happened decades ago. If they honored Catherine's memory, if they restored the house with respect for its history, they could make it a home again. They'd donated Catherine's belongings from the sealed room to the Portland Police Bureau, which had returned them to distant relatives of the Hartwell family. They'd decided to restore the bedroom to its original proportions, but to create a small memorial in the corner, a plaque acknowledging Catherine and the tragedy that had occurred in this house. The sealed room, once opened, became just a room again, but its story would be remembered. Catherine Marie Hartwell remained officially listed as missing, though police now considered her deceased. Without a body, there could be no death certificate, no official closure for what remained of her family. But at least now people knew what had likely happened to her. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been abducted by a stranger. She'd been killed by her own father in the house where she'd grown up. Killed because she'd wanted the independence that should have been her right as an adult. Her story became a reminder of something dark that could hide behind closed doors and ordinary facades, the possessiveness that could masquerade as love, the control that could be mistaken for protection, and the violence that could erupt when someone decided another person belonged to them and not to themselves. The sealed room had kept its secret for 46 years, but walls, even thick walls built of brick and concealed behind layers of construction, couldn't keep secrets forever. Eventually, someone had come along with a sledgehammer and a renovation plan, and the truth had emerged into the light. Catherine Hartwell's story was finally known. Not completely. There were still questions that would never be answered, a body that might never be found. But the mystery of what had happened to the young woman who disappeared in August 1978 had been solved. She'd never left home that morning. She'd never driven away in her blue Pinto. She'd never had the chance to start the independent life she'd wanted. Instead, she'd become a secret her father had kept, a memory he'd preserved in a sealed room, a daughter he'd loved so intensely and wrongly that he'd destroyed both her life and his own. The house at the end of the tree-lined street in Portland stood quietly, its Victorian architecture as graceful as ever. Inside, renovations continued, transforming it into a family home once again. But now, everyone who passed by knew its story. The story of Catherine Hartwell and the room that had been sealed shut for nearly half a century, hiding a father's terrible secret and a daughter's stolen future.